to your name. So you might have several scattered in the J pile or whatever letter your name begins with. So they'll be filtering through those. I'm looking forward to this new sermon series, Real Life Relationships. How do we relate and love with those that we disciple? And this is, there can't be a more challenging series of messages for me personally. So I feel like such a novice when it comes to relationships. And even though I'm 64 years old and have had a lot of relationships, when I look at the life of Jesus and how he related to people, I'm just blown away constantly at how much I have to learn in order to really experience relationship the way that Jesus wants us to experience it, especially with those that we're in discipleship relationships with. Now, if you're here this morning and you're one of those folks that don't think you really have a problem in relationships, you're really not going to learn much from what we're going to share. I mean, if you think you've got it all together as far as relationships, then, you might as well just check out because you're not going to really learn much. You know, I seem to experience a lot of ladies that really feel like they're good at relationships. And let me tell you something about that I've observed from all of my vast years of experience. One of the reasons that you think you're really good at it is that you compare yourself with your husband. And I want you to understand something about that comparison. You are making a really mistake if you're evaluating yourself and how you relate to other people based upon your husband. I want to lift you to a higher standard, and that is, I want you to compare yourself with Jesus. You know, I don't want you to compare yourself with your husband when it comes to real life relationships and how you relate to other people. You know, other thing I want to say to you is that we've got these blind spots in our life when it comes to relating that we don't see. That's why they're called blind spots, right? And it's amazing how everyone else can see them, but we can't see them. Well, one of the values of what we're going to do for the next several weeks is that if you really enter into real life relationships with people, you begin to discover a lot of those blind spots that you have in your life. For example, one of the blind spots that many people have when it comes to relationships is that they just feel compelled, almost obsessively, to try to fix people. Do you know it's really difficult to be in a really personal relationship with someone that's trying to fix you all the time? In fact, you're going to find yourself wanting to distance yourself from that person. It reminds me of the story I heard of the fella who was leaving church with his wife. And he told his wife that he would pick her up out in front of the church. And so he went to get the car, and she went out to the front of the church. Well, in a few minutes, all of a sudden, the fella just whizzed right by her in his car. And then a few moments later, apparently he turned around and he came back and he picked her up. And she got in the car and they took off. Well, the next week, a fella at church who had witnessed the whole thing happen said to this fella, "You left your wife standing there and went right by her and didn't pick her up. And then you turned around and came back and picked her up." And he said, "When did you remember that you had forgot her?" And he said, "Well, when I got to the intersection and nobody was telling me which direction to go." You know, that lady may not even realize that she has a problem with that. That she's always trying to fix him in some way, and how that impacts him and how that impacts a relationship. And so one of the things that's really valuable about what we're going to accomplish is that if you'll really get involved in real life relationships, a lot of those blind spots will begin to be exposed so they can be dealt with. You can't deal with something that you really don't even know is there, you know? And it's important that we evaluate where we're really at. So this morning we're going to begin with an introduction to this series, and I'll just shut it down when I see that, you know, we're getting close to 11:45. I'll just shut it down then, and we'll pick up there next week. It's going to be one of those kind of series, and I want to really make sure that I try to address the things that you really need, we all need, when it comes to relationships. Well, let's just start out. You know, definitions are real important. And so let's talk about, what do I mean by real life relationships? That's the title of the sermon series. That's the main title. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that, when I talk about real life relationships, a real life relationship is sharing life with a person that you give the right to know everything about you, and they give you the right to know everything about them. That's what I mean by a real life relationship. You know, one of the men that I disciple has told me that I am one of only 3 people in his life that he gives the right to know everything about him. One of 3, he's told me that. You know, in my experience in dealing with people, 3 is really a lot. Having 3 people in your life that you give the right to know everything about you, I've discovered that for many people, that's a lot of people. What I've discovered is that most people don't have one person in their life that they give the right to know everything about them. And that includes many people that are married don't give their wife the right or their husband the right. This last few years, I've been discipling a guy, and he has gone into debt financially and not told his wife. A significant amount of money. And she doesn't know about it. And she didn't know about it. And here's the problem. One of the main problems with that, to add to that, is that this is the 3rd time that he's done it in their marriage. I mean, even his wife, he hadn't given her the right to know everything about him. I'm grateful that he was willing to tell me that so I could be a part of the solution, you know, to that particular problem. I can't help a guy that I'm discipling if I don't know that, right? And so, you know, a lot of people don't have one person in their life that they give the right to know everything about them. And I want you to understand this. This is especially true of pastors. Most pastors, in fact, you know, the latest statistic that I read says that 70% of pastors that have been surveyed say they are lonely. Do you understand the connection between loneliness and not one person in your world that knows everything about you, or you don't give the right to know everything about you? Do you understand the connection between loneliness and that? And so 70% of pastors are lonely, and the reason they're lonely is they don't have one person in their life, even perhaps their spouse, their wife, that they give the right to know everything about them. 50% of pastors that start out in ministry will not last 5 years. And I believe there's a connection there between being lonely and not having anyone in your life that knows everything about you or you're willing to share everything about you. And pastors washing out after just 5 years of ministry. Well, why are real life relationships important? Well, I've already said a few things to you, but we need a biblical foundation for this, right? We're a Bible-believing people, and we need to understand why God wants us to have these real-life relationships with others. Well, in Genesis 2:5, that's where the biblical foundation was laid. And here's what God said in Genesis 2:5. It says, it's not good that man should be alone. Now, I want us to understand that this was before the fall of man into sin. So God had created everything, in creation and created the first man, and everything was good, God said. And then he said about his creation, here's one thing that's not good. It's not good for man to be alone. So God knew this from the very beginning. And the reason God knew it is that he created us like him. And in God, there is a Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. When you look at the ministry of Jesus, Jesus is always talking about his relationship with his Father. And you get the impression from everything that Jesus was saying, even though he was a member of the Godhead, the Son of God, there was an interaction, there was an exchange, there was a fellowship going on. I would just imagine that in the Godhead, they are completely transparent with one another, don't you think? And so God created us in his image, in his likeness. Now, we don't have his attributes, but in his likeness. And so God knew when he created that first man, it wasn't good for man to be alone. God created us with a need to walk with one another. And in that walking with one another, to know one another. And that need that we have is a spiritual need. In other words, I need others in my life spiritually. I don't need to be walking alone spiritually. And it's also true mentally, emotionally, and physically. In fact, we're interconnected. We can't fulfill the purpose that God has for us in our lives as a lone ranger living in isolation. We have to be in relationship with others in order to be healthy physically, mentally, spiritually, and then also to accomplish the purposes that God has for us. I guarantee you, Adam could not reproduce, be fruitful and multiply without Eve. And I want you to understand that when it comes to God's purpose for your life, you can't accomplish it without having real-life relationship with others. Now, real-life relationships are even more important since the fall of man. In other words, the fall of man and man's fall into sin really began to jeopardize real-life relationships, because what did it do? Immediately, sin entering into the human race began to destroy unity between people. And we see it in the first story in the Bible, really after the fall of man. A guy kills his brother. That's what sin does. It divides, it separates. But when you think about the fall of man, the truth is real life relationships are more important even now after the fall of man than they were before. I mean, what if Cain was in a real life relationship with someone and he was having these murderous thoughts about his brother? And before he went and killed his brother, he confided in someone about his evil intentions and his evil thoughts and his hurt feelings that he had toward God. Perhaps the whole thing could have been avoided if he would have been in a real life relationship with someone. Have you ever thought that, when someone comes in and they sort of stun you with an announcement that they've done something really wrong? I mean, I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. Where someone that I thought I knew, I didn't know, and they told me something about themselves that was just shocking. One of my first thoughts when I hear that is, well, bless their hearts. Does anyone else know this? I mean, they didn't just start dealing with this today. Have they been walking this out alone And how long have they been walking this out alone? Do you understand that that's probably the primary way that Satan gains a foothold in people's life? Is that he isolates them. They don't have any real life relationships in their life. Nobody really knows them. And before you know it, Satan captures them and leads them in ways that he wants to lead them. Sin, I've discovered, leads to isolation. I mean, what's your natural response when you really do something wrong that you feel shameful about? Yeah, you want to just hide it, right? You just want to keep it to yourself. We don't want to let anybody else know. And you can even justify doing that and saying, I don't want to hurt people. And if I tell people about that, it's just really going to hurt them. But the truth is, when you isolate yourself because of a sin, you have become in bondage to wherever Satan wants to lead you. And it's only going to get worse before it gets better. And that's why the Bible puts a real value on confession. Confession. And confession is acknowledging, what's going on in me. Whether it's emotional or mental or spiritual or, something that I've done wrong in my behavior. Confession is just acknowledging that to God. And you need to have people in your life that you can have those kind of relationships with. You know what real life relationships create? I mean, the moment I tell Brandon, I'm really struggling with this emotionally. The moment I share that with him in our relationship, it creates an accountability between him and I. That's what it creates immediately. What if I don't share that? Well, I don't have the accountability, right? And that's what happens. When you are in a real life relationship with someone, it creates accountability. But it also creates this. It creates an opportunity for encouragement that I'm not going to receive unless I'm really transparent with someone. In other words, if I'm honest with Brandon about something I'm feeling, I'm going to receive encouragement from him. And the way I'm going to receive that is that he's going to be a good listener first and foremost. And we're going to talk about that. He's not going to try to fix me right away and say, well, you shouldn't feel that way about Steve Maness. I can't believe you did that to that name wall. I didn't know that till today, by the way. He's not going to immediately say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Oh, that's wrong. There's ways that we need to learn how to relate to each other that encourage that transparency. But he's going to encourage me in the right way. And not only that, not only is there accountability and encouragement when you have a real life relationship with someone, you have the opportunity to receive their support. I've seen this over and over in my life. When I was honest with someone about the way I was feeling or thinking or something I had done wrong, they began to support me in some way I didn't expect, in some way that I did not anticipate. Well, who should I choose? If I'm going to have real life relationships, who should I choose for these real life relationships? Yeah, you do need to be wise in this decision. I'm not recommending that you have real life relationships with everybody on the planet. I'm not even recommending that you have real life relationships with everybody in a church. So who do you choose? Back when I was a teenager, one of the verses that someone shared with me, and it was shared in this context, you'll become like the people that you walk with. That was the way it was shared with me. You'll become like the people that you walk with, that you share life with. You'll become like them. And the verse that was used was a proverb. It's Proverbs 13:20, and I put it to memory back then, and it's been an important verse in my life. And he who walks with wise men will become wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Well, I want you to know that was a good start for me when it came to real life relationships, I began to go, okay, well, what's a wise man? Who is a wise man that I should be real with and share my life with? You know who Jesus chose when it came to living a real life relationship? And this is who I choose now. He chose those he discipled. Now, that was sort of risky. It was sort of risky because you see, Jesus chose 12 lost guys to be his first disciples. You know, when you look at those disciples, I think it's my tendency and your tendency to look at those 12 disciples like they were Christians. Listen, folks, they were not Christians when Jesus chose them. I mean, they did not become Christians, born-again Christians, until after Jesus died, rose again, and the Holy Spirit was poured out. That's when they became Christians. And so Jesus was going to disciple these guys to salvation. That's what he was going to do. Disciple them to salvation. And so, but he chose to have a real life relationship with these 12 guys that he was discipling to salvation. As you look at Jesus living with these guys, and this is what's so challenging to me as I'm trying to learn from him, one of the things that Jesus understood as he was discipling others is that, and see, this is where most pastors don't get it, is that if you don't live a real life with those you're discipling, do you think they're going to live a real life with you? You get it? If I don't share with those I'm discipling the things that are ugly in me, the things that are broken in me, the things that God's still working on in me and still needing to fix in me, if I don't share with those people that I'm discipling those kind of things, what kind of disciple am I going to make? Oh, probably one sort of like a Pharisee. Because isn't that the picture you have of the Pharisees? That they didn't have real life relationships going on? That they were hiding a bunch of things that Jesus was constantly trying to get them to expose? And they weren't really living real life relationships with their other Pharisees. And you know what? Jesus said, don't be like them. Don't be like them. And he told the Pharisees, he said, look, you know, you are a Pharisee. And he told them what he thought about the way they were living and how they would, you know, shine up the outside of the cup, but the inside was filthy. And they weren't dealing with the deeper issues of their hearts that were causing sin problems in their life. And he told them how, and he said to them, and you're making disciples that are worse than you. Well, yeah, I look at that and man, I go, maybe that's happened in my life. Maybe that's happened in the church of Jesus. Because we're really, as leaders, not living a real life with those that we're discipling. Recently, with one of the guys I was discipling, it's actually Thomas Hill. He wouldn't mind me using his name in this story. And so after one of our meetings, he said to me, that'll be, and I can't remember the money figure that he gave me. He said, that'll be, let's just say $100 for the therapy session we just had. He said that to me. Now, why would he say that to me? Because I was being real with him about what was going on in my life. Because I understand this. He's not going to be real with me unless I'm real with him. Jesus bore his soul with those disciples. You know, he didn't have any sins to confess because he was the perfect Lamb of God who came to take away the sins of the world. But Jesus was constantly bearing his soul. And by that I mean he was wearing his emotions out there on his sleeve with his disciples so they could see. I mean, he didn't hide his grief when he was going to the cross from his disciples, did he? I mean, he wore that. They didn't really take it seriously, apparently, because as he was exposing himself to them, what were they doing? Sleeping. We'll talk about that. That's not a good way to relate to people in love, right? You know, but he wore that right out there in front of him. It wasn't like he was trying to go before his disciples and say, you know, I'm such a spiritually strong and mature individual. I really don't mind going to the cross for the sins of the world. No, he lived it out there. I mean, they saw him weep over one of his friends that had died. They saw him weep over Jerusalem. They saw the sorrow of his heart over Jerusalem. And I would have to say that when he cleansed the temple, there was some anger, right? That they were witnessing in him as he cleansed the temple. Do you get it? He was living a real life relationship. In fact, sometimes in his teaching, Jesus was 100% God, but he's also 100% man. And so he's experiencing in himself everything that you and I experience. And so just think about some of his teaching about discipleship. I mean, somebody came up to him and wanted to be his disciple. And he said, the birds of the air have nests, right? But the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Just think about that. How honest that is. How transparent that was. And this wasn't even one of his disciples that he was discipling. And so Jesus modeled it for us, what it means to be in a real life relationship. And he knew, this is what Jesus knew. And this is what we've got to get, and this is what we've been working on, and we've got a good start as a church. I think we're on the right road. What Jesus knew and understood was that real life, being real in a fallen world, was necessary for discipleship to succeed. And I think his disciples got it. I think they went out and did with others exactly what Jesus did with them. And then I think they passed that on to the church. If you read in the early book of Acts, I think you've got a group of people that was living real life with each other. I mean, incredibly. In fact, the first time that a guy keeps a secret, it wasn't a good situation. His name was Ananias, and his wife was Sapphira, and they kept a secret. It's like, oh my goodness, that was pretty harsh from my perspective. You know what? They weren't being real. They weren't being honest. They weren't being transparent. And in this case, it was with the leadership of the church. They were creating the idea that they were giving more than what they were actually giving. So anyway, Jesus lived this real life. He taught his disciples. And so, right now you're going, well, who should I get in this relationship with? I'm hoping that's right now, that's what you're thinking if you don't already have it. Well, if you're not discipling anyone, start with those you choose to disciple you. Do you know you have a choice about that? I suppose you do. That's why you're here this morning. You've walked into this building to hear a message from me and hear our worship leaders proclaiming the truth in song. And so by doing that, you're actually choosing us to disciple you this morning. But who's going to do that on an ongoing basis after today? If you're not discipling anyone and you're wanting to have a real life relationship, then start with those you choose to disciple you. And I can tell you how we try to connect people in those relationships here at Western Hills. Take the first step by joining one of our small groups. That's the way you take the first step. If you're wanting to enter into some real life relationships for the purpose of discipleship, then you need to take the first step by entering into one of our small groups. You might go going, well, are they safe? Are those small groups safe? Well, the way I would say it is that we try to make them as safe as possible. We try to make these groups as safe as possible. I mean, we want strangers to enter into our group and feel within the first 30 minutes like they could bare their soul to the group. That's what we want to happen. Is that always happening? No. Not all of our groups are where they need to be. And all of our groups are progressing and growing in their understanding of what we're really about, you know. And so we're all at different places, but that's what we want to see happen. We want to see someone walk into our group and just bare their soul with something that's going on in their life. And that's a starting point. So what do we do to make our group safe? Well, we didn't come up with these. Someone else came up with these. Probably started in addiction recovery is where it probably all started. But we have these guidelines. And you see, they understand the guidelines are just to create a safe place for people to start developing real-life relationships with other believers. That's what these guidelines are all for. Now, how many of you all that are in groups find that these guidelines are difficult for you to adhere to? Raise your hand. Some of you are telling the truth, some of you are not. Let me ask your group leaders about you. You know, there's so many of those guidelines that, like, how about we want everybody to participate? And we have some folks that come and they just don't hardly participate at all, you know? And then we have people that in our group, my group, that are teachers. And teachers like to teach. And so when they hear someone share something, they want to immediately either clarify the truth or fix them right there on the spot. And I have to go, no fixing, no fixing. Why? Because I know that person's going to shut down. You know, I have found that wives are really good at confessing the sins of their husbands in group. Have you seen that in your group? I mean, there's some that are just really good at confessing their husband's sins. Or sometimes one of them will be sharing and the other one finishes the story. Like, oh, thank you very much. And you know, I look at the one that is getting finished on, and they just sort of start shutting down. It's not safe, you understand? These guidelines are not meant to be rules to dictate things. They're meant to create an opportunity for a relational environment. It's what we call it, where real-life relationships can begin to happen between people. How about that one, you know, no dominating? You know, in our group, we had to come up with a new name for that. No ping-ponging. Because it wasn't just one person that would dominate. This person over here would start dominating, and then when they were done, it would flip over here. And then when they were done, it would flip back to that person. And then it would go back to this person. And I looked at my group one day, and they were going. And so I decided no ping-ponging. I just told them that. That's a new rule for us. And then the group grew. And before you know it, we had more people in the group. And then I had to say no doubles ping-ponging. That's where you've got 4 people in a group of 15 dominating the group. Some of you look really guilty right now. Some of you look are you okay? You know, what I've discovered about these guidelines is that all of these guidelines are really ways to demonstrate love to people. And if you would start seriously learning those guidelines and applying them to your life in one-to-one relationships, you would be amazed at how those relationships one-to-one would begin to change. If you just began to apply it to your marriage, for example, your marriage relationship, these right here, it'll impact your marriage. You'll start seeing in your marriage a greater openness for the other person to begin to be open. You know, sometimes I hear someone, they're just not really open. They just, you know, whatever. And I'm around them for like 15 minutes and I'm going, well, I know why. You know, one of the reasons why. Something there that needs to change. Don't fix them. Don't finish their sentences. Don't tell them what they're thinking. Don't tell them how they're feeling. What are you doing? You know, they're not going to be transparent. They're not going to be open. You're not going to have a real life relationship as long as you're operating in ways that are unloving. From the life of Jesus, we know that real life relationships are the rails that effective discipleship travels on. I mean, that's not all there is to it. I mean, we've got to know the truth, and the truth will set us free. But real life relationship, like Jesus had with his disciples, are the rails that effective discipleship travels on. Jesus modeled this for us by choosing 12 guys to have real life relationships on this relational journey. And isn't it a journey? You know, I hear people think, well, we got a discipleship program and we hope to reproduce every year. Really? I mean, you can map out the journey that way? I mean, I don't think that's a bad goal to have. But the truth is, how do I know when a person is going to grow to a place and spiritually mature place where they're really ready to reproduce? I don't know that. I mean, my goodness, it took Jesus 3.5 years to lead these 12 guys, well, 11 of them, to salvation. And he was Jesus. So we've got to be patient. But we follow Jesus by doing with others what he did with his disciples. And we choose people to be on a real life relational journey with us. And so at Western Hills, the first step is joining a group. Now, there's a picture here. This is our group as it existed in December. We've since reproduced. And we normally don't sing in the group, but one of the pictures is of us singing. One of the guys brought his guitar that night, and we sang together for a while. But I like the picture most that's over here on the right. That's Pam there. Just some interaction that's going on there, either before or after group. Man, I love group. But the reason I love group is I love real life relationships. And that's where you can form them at Western Hills. When you go to a group, you're going to meet some people that are having real life relationships with one another. I'm not saying everybody is in a group by any means, but you're going to meet some people if you go to a group that are. And while you're there, you may meet one or more people that you can share life with at deeper levels. In other words, when we're meeting with group, especially when there's an everyone group or a mixed group, there's things that guys don't share with the women in the room that we're going to share at another time when we're living life together. Jesus had a multi-level ministry. He ministered to the multitudes, but then the Bible tells us about 70 folks that apparently he was living life with at some level. And then we all know about the 12, but did you know about the 12? There was Peter, James, and John. And do you know that he shared life at a deeper level with those 3 guys than he did all of the rest of them? In fact, John thought he was the most beloved of all the disciples because of the relationship that he had with Jesus. When you join a group, you will be introduced to people that are broken just like you, but they're on mission for Jesus. And through real life relationships in group, you'll begin to learn that your life can make a difference one person at a time. Have you ever felt like, my life can't really make a difference? Man, if I could just be like Brandon, be multi-talented, multi-gifted, he can stand up and preach and do a great job preaching. He can just spin right over there to the piano, and he can just spin something off on the piano. And then after he gets off the piano, he can go down and he can lead 101 or 102 or whatever else it is that he's organized and administrated. And man, I wish I was like him so my life can make a difference. I want you to understand something, that the greatest difference that Brandon's life is going to make is going to be through real life relationships that he has with people, one person at a time. That's going to be the greatest impact he makes in this world. And you know what? You can do that. One person at a time. You can do that. When we were up at Post Falls, Idaho recently, one of the things that I saw is that on their staff, there was all of these guys, and they're now serving full-time there at that church. It's over 5,500 people now and hundreds of groups. And they're living out. Its name of the ministry is Real Life Ministry. So this is the essence of their whole congregation in church. It's what they're about. And one of the things I noticed about these full-time staff members they had in their church is that most of them were not professionally trained. I mean, good night. They hadn't been to Bible college. And some of them were holding these significant positions, and they hadn't even been to seminary. What's going on there? How can a church grow like that and you don't have all of these professionally trained guys on your team and on your staff? Well, one of them explained it real well. He's on staff there full time, and he stood up and he told his story, and he told about coming to Christ and how that happened in his life. And then he told him about coming to Real Life Ministries and getting plugged in there to that church. And he said, I started attending group, and while I was attending group, and I began to experience real life relationships, I began to think, I can make a difference. Now, he was good at what he did in whatever business he was in, but he began to really think, I can make a difference. Not because I'm a talented preacher, not because I can play the piano, not because of any other reason other than, you know what? I can do this. I can enter into real life relationships with people. And I can lead them in the way it's happening here. And so he went from that revelation to being full-time on the staff there, and that's what's happened to so many of the guys. Let me close with this morning. For many people in most churches, learning to make disciples is not even on their radar. It's not there. I mean, church is something you do once a week, and different people have different reasons for doing it. It doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to them, but as far as them really being on mission to make disciples, it's not even on many people's radar that are attending church. So many in the church are in that place because in so many churches, that's not being communicated. But that's the mission of every believer in the church, is to make disciples and to be in real life relationships for that purpose. One of the ways to avoid the challenge of marriage is don't get married. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can be born a celibate, not get married, or God may call you to celibacy as a Christian. But I want you to understand something. If you follow Jesus, discipleship celibacy is not an option. It's not an option. Now, I'm just going to be attending. I'm not going to really make disciples. I want you to understand, if you follow Jesus, that is not an option. It's not an option for several reasons. One is being a disciple of Jesus that makes disciples of Jesus is who you are if you're born again of the Spirit. I mean, your spirit has been united with the Spirit of Jesus. What do you think the Spirit of Jesus in you is wanting you to do? Well, be who you are now. And who you are is what? A disciple. And what do disciples do? Well, if they're born in the image of Jesus, they make disciples because that's what he does. And the other reason is that it's not an option. It's because being a disciple that disciples others is who Jesus calls you to be. He bookended it at the beginning of his ministry on earth in Matthew 4:19 and Matthew 28:19 and 20 at the end. He bookended. He just made it really clear. Here's the bookends. This is what it's all about, is making disciples. This is really our line in the sand as a church. If you want to know what's our line in the sand, well, there's a number of things that are, doctrinal issues that we would say, you know what, if you want to walk with us, you've got to be on this side of the line. Important doctrinal statements about what we believe about salvation and, what we believe about the Bible and what we believe about the Holy Spirit. Certainly, those are all things where we say, if you want to walk with us, you got to step across that line. We're not going to step across that line. We're not going to compromise what we believe here. But, where we've drawn a line in the sand, where we're inviting people to step across the line, is making disciples through real life relationships. That's the line in the sand. that calling of God upon every one of us to believe. Have you stepped across that line yet? I mean, some of you are like, I don't think so. You know, you just, but you just haven't jumped over the line and say, I'm all in. I'm all in to real life relationships. You know, with these names that we're putting up here on the wall, and they're so important that we pray, and we're going to pray here as we close the service today again for these names here. It's so important that we pray. But let me ask you something. Have you put a name up there yet of someone that's lost, and you're going to be intentional about living a real life relationship with them? Have you thought about that? I mean, isn't that what Jesus did with 12 lost guys? Isn't that what you should do to follow him? Is at least one person at a time, put a name up here, and you're going to be intentional about living a real life relationship with them. Now, I can't promise you how they'll respond. I don't know that. But you do your part. God will do his part, and then we'll see how the other person responds as we do that. Step across the line today. Come and join us. I'm going to turn it over to Brandon. He's going to lead us in prayer.
Well, we have the opportunity to pray for these people that we've been putting on the wall. And if you haven't added a name yet, you can do that even during the prayer meeting here. Pam, do you know how many we need here for, how many? 3 per group right now. Okay, so we want to keep adding these names back. I know that last week we had more like 7 or 8. And so help us keep adding these names back on the wall. We're sorry about that mishap there. But our heart this morning as we begin this time of prayer is we want to remember that this is really the wall of the dead. I think about going to Washington, D.C., and maybe some of you have been there or a place like it where they have a memorial. Or maybe down at the Oklahoma City bombing area with all the chairs. And when you walk into that area, it's a really sombering feeling because you look at the wall or the memorial that's there and you realize that what's represented here are the dead. And what we need to remember this morning as we look at this wall and begin this time of prayer is that these are the names of the dead. That if Jesus doesn't move and draw them to salvation, that they're going to spend forever separated from God in an eternal state of death in a place called hell. And that's their present state, dead. And our prayer is that God would resurrect them. And our belief is that Jesus is divine. Do you believe that's true? That he is God? Our belief is that his word is divine. Do you believe that's true? That his word is divine? And our belief is that his method is divine. That what Jesus did and modeled in real life relationships is his intention for our lives as well. So let's begin this time of prayer, and as we do, we're going to do it just somberly, just before the Lord, with our hearts being transparent to him and asking him to move. And if you're able to stay for this prayer meeting, we want to invite you to do that. We won't be long, and we want to encourage you to pray with us here this morning. If you need to slip out, we understand, but here's how we're going to facilitate this. Our small group leaders, their names are along the walls all the way around here in the auditorium. If you're a small group leader, I want to ask you if you would stand right now and come to the wall and grab 3 names, and then if we have a few extra,